Hi everyone, this is lecture 13. I'm just going to continue talking about hominoid taxa here. Really, I'm going to continue talking about humans' evolution through taxonomical categories. We're just going to review the genus Australopithecus to begin with, and then we'll move right on to our own genus Homo. So, just to review, members of the genus Australopithecus were somewhat arboreal, but were also habitually bipedal. We know they were bipedal because of the structures of the ilia and the tibia in specimens like Lucy and Ardi. And we know they were probably still somewhat arboreal, that is, living in trees or hanging out in trees for some of the time, because of curved finger bones found associated with, again, famous specimens like Lucy and Ardi. But again, you can find these characteristics in other specimens from this group. And also, just one more time to review, even though Australopithecus is a genus and Ardipithecus is a genus, we can still say that both of these genera are Australopithecines. Basically, just a general term for these transitional characters on the way from knuckle-walking apes to bipedal Homo. Anyway, to continue, like other hominoids, members of the genus Australopithecus had expanded cortexes. Remember, Lucy had maybe about the same amount of brain power as a chimpanzee, or who knows about her brain power, but rather brain size is what we can tell from fossils. Also, like other hominoids, Australopithecus and Australopithecines were probably very social beings, probably very attentive parents, and probably also grew up quite slowly compared to other animals. Also, there is some evidence to suggest that Australopithecines had the ability to adapt to environments technologically. We'll talk about that a little bit when we start talking about stone tools. So, as we're talking about the evolution of genus Homo from the genus Australopithecus, uh, really, one of the major characteristics to keep track of here is expanding cranial capacity and the profile of the skull. So, whenever you see this, CC, that means cranial capacity. I've probably already been using this term. And so it doesn't mean cranial capacity, rather, it means cubic centimeters. Oh my gosh, I'm leading you astray so early in this lecture. And so 400 cubic centimeters is about how much brain a chimpanzee has. Gracile Australopithecines, like Lucy, about as much, about 450 cubic centimeters. But a human being has 1,400 on average, right? All of this area here is occupied by brain in a human. All this area here would be occupied by brain in an Australopithecus, and here's a chimpanzee. So there's another trait we can look at that's related to cranial capacity, and that is prognathism. It's related to cranial capacity on an intraspecies level. Human beings, may be more or less prognathic than one another, but they will still have generally about the same cranial capacity. What I'm really talking about is differences between species. So here you'll notice that a chimpanzee and an Australopithecus, their mouths and noses seem to jut out more from the face, right? But on a human, the mouth and nose is in line with the orbital plane. And also take note that the whole face has been tucked underneath the cranium, underneath the part of the head that's holding the brain, whereas the brain is really behind the eyes on Pan and Australopithecus. The brain extends above the eyes on Homo. This is where we get our big, tall foreheads from. So humans' reduced facial structure reflects an adaptation to accommodate an expanded neocortex. So, right, we tucked our faces underneath our skulls in order to get room for these big brains. It's a reduction of selective pressure on the dental arcade. So we have smaller teeth. We don't need to have quite as big a mouth. Why would there be less pressure on humans to have big teeth than there would have been on Australopithecus and Pan to have big teeth? And also, our facial structure being reduced in this way uh, could be a result of sexual selection. That is to say, that maybe at some point, late Australopithecus or early Homo just started to find it sexy to have less prognathism, or a face tucked in under a skull, or to have a large forehead. Certainly, we find things like large foreheads to be attractive. It's a feature that we appreciate in children, especially, and when we anthropomorphize animals in order to make them look like human characters, such as in cartoons, we often give them large foreheads as well. So it's something that humans find attractive. So this process of brain expansion is called encephalization. Encephalization, uh, for our purposes, is something that takes place over the course of evolutionary time. Um, and this is just the gradual expansion of brain size from Australopithecus to Homo to contemporary humans. So I want you to remember that natural selection acts on complexes, not single traits. Okay, so the expansion of the brain was in and of itself uh, not the whole story. The expansion of the brain occurred alongside uh, Australopithecines and Homo's complex sociality, or the increasing complexity of the social forms that these organisms could have. Brain expansion was an adaptation that occurred alongside more intense tool use as humans emerged from Australopithecines. It occurred alongside an extended childhood because, well, that's really what that extended childhood is there for, to program all that, well, not to program necessarily, but to gear all that neural matter to the world that the child will be living in as an adult, right? And that brain expansion also occurred alongside the expansion of symbolic thought. We often think of the brain as making these things possible, but you don't need to have a huge brain in order to do these things necessarily. Rather, these things might have been abilities that smaller brained ancestors of ours had uh, that became part of the environment in which having a larger brain would have been adaptive, right? We'll talk about this more with tool use, but just to start thinking about it, remember that every human that's ever been born and every, not just every human, but every human ancestor that's ever been born, from Homo to Australopithecus to the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees. Every creature that's ever been born in that line has been born into a world where there has been culture of some kind. Apes have culture, and therefore culture and the passing on of traditions begins at least with them, if we're looking at our story. And so traditions, using tools, and thinking about the world in typically primate ape ways was part of the environment that would have favored having a large brain. The brain does not make culture and tool use and an extended childhood and symbolic thinking possible per se. Rather, it exists in a circuit with these things, at least if we're looking at it at an evolutionary scale. So, at this point in the class, there are two different ways we can discuss the history of the human species, right? The first way is we can discuss humans uh, and even our earlier ancestors among the Australopithecines, whether we're talking about Ardipithecus or Australopithecus. We can discuss these guys as a diverse group of related species, most of which we know only from fossils, right? We only know about one hominoid, not one hominoid, but one hominin, or not even hominin. These terms, these taxonomical terms, are so sketchy. We only know about one human-like creature, really, from our own experience, and that would be us. All the other species of humans we know about, all the Australopithecines, these are all known only from fossils. This way of looking at history is the biological way, right? We're looking at a group of organisms, and we're looking at sort of the changes that that family underwent through time. We can also talk about human history at this point as an ongoing culture. And this culture didn't, I say here that it began about 2 million years ago, but it really would have begun uh, way back with our ape ancestors. I mean, if we can say that orangutans and gorillas and chimpanzees, as well as humans, all have culture, then we might be able to guess that the capacity for cultural exchange or the capacity for sustaining traditions is something that would have been shared by all of their common ancestors, which is to suggest that the culture which we participate in, and remember that culture, at least for our purposes, will focus on tradition. It's focusing on something that's getting passed on between generations, not genetically, but rather through teaching and observation. So if we look at it this way, actually, this ongoing culture, this cultural history of humans, we have to start maybe 12 million years ago or 20 million years ago. Um, and this is really sort of an exciting concept, isn't it? Because we think of ourselves as cultural creatures. We think of humans as the things with culture. We think about our cultures as things that only humans do, right? I mean, if you're in anthropology too, you're talking about things like religion and ritual. But from this evolutionary point of view, these cultures have their roots at least 2 million years ago with the beginning of our genus Homo, but even farther back among non-human organisms who also passed on traditions and made tools. But either way, I want you to keep in mind that morphology, that is our bodies, our anatomy, our behavior, and our technologies evolved together, right? It's hard to tell the organism from the environment. All these things play against one another. All these things constitute the setting against which the other characters were intensified. So, to talk about humans, right? So, we're going to stick to humans as a biological fossil species for this lecture. So, we are humans, members of the genus Homo. And as you already know, humans are fully bipedal, although we're a little bit arboreal as kids, aren't we? It's a lot easier for children to climb trees than it is for adults to. And we do certainly seem to be drawn to trees. Uh, we have really, I guess you could say, gross encephalization of the neocortex. That means that our brains are just very big. We have a lot more of the wiggly, noodle-like top and front part of our brains than other mammals, other primates, and other apes. And we are even more intensely social, even more intensely invested in our children, and we take even longer to grow up than other apes. Humans use fire. Maybe not all humans. Fire's a sketchy one. It's hard to tell when we started using fire. But certainly, all late humans used fire. Fire has certainly played a role in our evolution. Gets back to that teeth thing. Why do humans tend to have smaller teeth than other apes? And we all adapt to our environments technologically. That is, humans use tools and we build things. So, Homo species. Whenever you see this abbreviation SPP, it means it's just an abbreviation for any number of species within the within the genus being marked. So any number of Homo species. We're going to start talking about all the Homo species. So we figure that the first humans evolved from grasshopper Australopithecines about 2 million years ago in the Pleistocene. Right? Here's that picture again, and here's the little humans with their fire. The 2 million year mark would be around there. And we can see a different version of it here, a phylogenetic version. This is a complicated tree, and it shows some theoretical, not theoretical, but rather hypothetical connections. See, it looks like if we're moving from left to right through time, right? So here's 4 million, 3 million, 2 million, 1 million years ago, the present time. It looks like actually that things are evolving to come together, but that's not actually the case. These dotted dashy lines are proposed connections, right? It's not like Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus afarensis joined forces to make Homo habilis. That's not necessarily the case. These are hypothetical connections. But at any rate, what you can see is that the first humans appeared about 2 million years ago. Really what you're looking at here is populations that are very similar. So they've given different names to afarensis and africanus and gari here. But really, these might be populations that would have been reproducing together and trading genes back and forth. That might explain some of the doubtfulness about which one of these gave rise to Homo habilis. It might have been all of them if they weren't separate species. In fact, let's talk about that. So there are a lot of human species. Depending on how you look at it, there might be just a handful of human species, 5, or there might be upwards of 20, 21, 22. So 2 ways to look at classification of humans, or really any taxonomical procedure, is sort of lumpers and splitters, right? Lumpers are people who want to keep things simple taxonomically. Splitters are people who think that there are lots of different kinds of species and that they all deserve their own designations and names, right? So this here is a lumper's view of the genus Homo. These are the characters I will be talking about the most. So let's see here. Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo habilis, Homo floresiensis, and Homo heidelbergensis. That's 6. 6 different species of humans. Other authorities, oh, well, okay, we'll put the lumpers definition up there. And this is actually a good point. Keep this in mind. Lumpers assume that, like our own species, there was a lot of diversity among early humans. And so every time you find a different population with their own distinct anatomical features, you don't have to name them a new species, right? Uh, future lumpers will look at all of contemporary human life in the fossil record that we leave behind millions or billions of years from now. And they might say, okay, well, these guys, they all look pretty different worldwide, but they're probably all one species. On the other hand, there might be splitters in the future who would look at all of contemporary populations, note that people from different parts of the world look differently, and give lots of different species names to what is really one species. So that was a metaphor, but back to paleoanthropology. If you were a splitter, you might find, how many names do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You might find 15 different species of humans. It's just a matter of how you categorize the fossils that you uncover. And in fact, there are even more species of humans that have been suggested. So really, it's upwards of 20. Just the splitter's mantra is, if it's a distinct population, if it's got different morphologies and different bodies, then we should consider them to be separate species until we know better. There's really a lot here. So, for instance, all these, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, Homo siloensis, Homo georgicus, Homo gautengensis, Homo rhodesiensis, Homo seprenensis, all of those might all be one species if you were a lumper. But really, it's who knows? It's far out. This is stuff that's hard to determine for sure. Remember, taxonomy is just a crutch, but it's a useful crutch. So let's go back to the taxonomy. Let's start talking about some species of humans. So the first humans were Homo habilis. That, as you can tell, this just means the handy people or handymen. They are the earliest known human fossils. In fact, some authorities argue that Homo habilis isn't even really a Homo, that Homo habilis is an Australopithecus, because they had really relatively small brains, somewhere between 500 cubic centimeters and 750 cubic centimeters, and they still had relatively prognathic faces. I guess this is just a question of where you want to draw the line between Australopithecus and Homo. If you define Homo as having a large brain capacity, then, well, what do you consider large? 500 cubic centimeters is more than a chimpanzee and more than an Australopithecus africanus. Who knows? Uh, Most Homo habilis were found in the Great Rift Valley, and their great age, which is about 2 million years to 1.8 million years, and their anatomical features and their location in the Great Rift Valley all suggest that they were basal to all other human populations. So what that means is that probably the case is that all other human species evolved from this first population of Homo habilis uncovered at the Great Rift Valley. So here are some Homo habilis fossils. These are some fossil flashcards for you. Uh, this guy is a pretty old one. That's why I include him here. KNMER 1813. A Homo habilis dating back to 1.9 million years ago. Uh, this is probably the most complete Homo habilis skull known. It might be a woman. It's hard to tell because the guesstimate about this individual's gender would be based on analysis of the facial dimensions. And as you can probably guess, we just don't have a whole lot of fossils from Homo habilis. I mean, sure, there are lots of specimens, but in the big scheme of things, it's not a whole lot, right? And so the comparisons that we can make between individuals of Homo habilis species only suggest that maybe males were significantly larger than females. Well, and what is significant? So anyway, so it might be a woman, but the rubric by which they've made this analysis is a little sketchy. Another good one, and this is another old one, really, is AL666. I guess that's an unfortunate number if you're superstitious, but this is actually a very interesting fossil, 2.3 million years old. It's been called Homo rudolfensis by its discoverers, right? They want to give it a separate species name. And the reason they do that is because it existed so far before other Homo habilis specimens. Although other authorities note that it's within range for within the range of measurements that one would expect for a Homo habilis. At any rate, what makes it a Homo and not an Australopithecus is this rounded dental arcade. Dental arcade, of course, is just the collection of teeth plus the jaw, perhaps, depending on how you look at it. But on humans, members of the genus Homo, it's rounded. Uh, on more prognathic species, or more prognathic genera, I should say, like Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, or Pan, it's more elongated, right, because their mouths jut out more. Also, you just note these are some relatively big teeth for a human. You can just sort of compare them to your own, I guess. I don't have any measurements for you. I think I go over this in the bone demo. Another interesting Homo habilis, or perhaps a Homo gotengensis, is STW53. So this was found at Sterkfontein. This was near the site where they uncovered Miss Please and many Australopithecine fossils. But it was a little later. It was about 2 million years old. And Sterkfontein's in South Africa, which is quite a ways away from the Great Rift Valley. So the idea here is that by 2 million years ago, Homo habilis had already expanded, already spread out from the Rift Valley. So this 2.3 million year old one fossil might be suggesting a more accurate, I guess, rather an older date for the appearance of Homo, and then we would have already been spreading around by 2 million years. We would have already been in South Africa. Some suggest it should have its own species name because of its far out location. And even though this is a fragmentary specimen, they can make a lot of measurements. They can make a lot of observations based on these fragments that suggest that these folks would have looked significantly different from these folks or these folks, right? So they suggest that maybe it should have its own name. Really, well, what's the point of splitting? Maybe, I don't know. So the folks who uncovered the first remains of Homo habilis, and really who have been I guess, really kind of leading the charge on paleoanthropology in Africa and really contributing to the whole shape of the field. Uh, are the Leakeys. You may have heard of the Leakeys. Let's introduce you to them. You may have heard of Louis Leakey and Mary Leakey. In fact, I've already introduced you to Mary Leakey. One of her famous discoveries were the footprints at Laetoli, which at the point when they were discovered was the oldest known evidence of bipedality. That was 3 million years. Now we have Ardipithecus, who pushes it back to 4.4 and maybe even past 5, but we'll see. We'll see. Um, Louis Leakey, you've already heard about as well. He was the he kind of initiated an effort to get ethnographic long-term field studies of apes underway, and that was because he was interested in learning more about our closest living relatives in order to understand something about our evolution from creatures who would have well, our evolution from the common ancestor of those guys as well as us. But actually, the Leakeys are an expansive clan, and they include all sorts of people. Um, these two in particular were known for their research at Olduvai Gorge. Anybody who reads the Far Side cartoons, for instance, is probably familiar with the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And it was their research that established the Great Rift Valley as the home of the earliest humans. They established the Great Rift Valley as the place where humans came from. Um, one interesting thing that I hope I can remember to mention when we get to those slides, which will be coming up soon, is that they demonstrated that the earliest humans, Homo habilis, were actually sympatric with robust Australopithecines. Sympatry means living together or coexisting. Now, that doesn't mean that the robust Australopithecines who lived at Olduvai were necessarily hanging around the campfire with Homo habilis. No, but it does mean that more than one species of a culture-bearing bipedal ape was existing in the same place at the same time. And that's sort of exciting because we don't really see that in the contemporary world. And plus, we tend to think of humans as the great replacers. You know, we move in and we replaced the earlier versions, just as we often move into a new environment and replace a lot of its fauna with ourselves or with animals we prefer. But that's not necessarily the case. We were sympatric, even with creatures close to us. So Kamoya Kimeu is a renowned fossil hunter who got his start working for the Leakeys at Olduvai as a laborer. But he quickly developed a talent for spotting bone and for uncovering fossils, and has been recognized as well, I guess, as a potent researcher in his own right. Uh, he found KNMER 1813, which we've already seen, and he also was responsible for uncovering Turkana Boy, whom we will talk about later. Richard Leakey is one of the Leakey children, and he's the only one of them to, well, he wasn't the only one of them to follow in their footsteps initially, but he's the only one of the Leakey children to really stay with anthropology, although he's also done a lot of work as a politician in Kenya as well. And he's done research at Homo in Ethiopia and at Lake Turkana as well, and we'll learn about Lake Turkana later. But he's been a big deal. Don Johansson and Tim White. Don Johansson here and Tim White, characters you already know. They worked as students among the Leakeys, and then went on to make their own discoveries and shake up the world of paleoanthropology in their own ways. And then Richard married Maeve Epps. Maeve became well, she was already studying anthropology, and then she has gone on to make many major finds of her own. Oh, including Kenyanthropus, whom we won't talk about, but it is a potential human ancestor. It looks like a very early Homo, maybe a divergent population of early Homo that broke off soon after Homo had emerged from Australopithecus. I'm not really sure what to do with it. I don't really cover it. She also discovered an Australopithecine species at Lake Turkana. Again, we'll talk about Lake Turkana later. Richard and Maeve have a daughter, Louise Leakey. This will be the third generation of Leakeys there, and she's been hunting fossils since she was a girl, apparently, right? I put it down right there. She leads ongoing excavations at Kubifora, and in fact, she has a TED Talk. And don't forget, of course, Leakey's angels, quote unquote, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, Baruti Gaudicus, and then several other prominent researchers like Gensua and Burhane Asfaw and Alan Walker got their starts among the Leakeys as well. It's just a big clan. These people have long arms, and they're sort of at the center of a expansive network of paleoanthropologists and other kinds of researchers who have been making really just these outstanding discoveries that have redefined the field of human evolution. So among the finds that the Leakeys made was this guy, Zinj, also sometimes called Nutcracker Man. He's an Australopithecus boisei, or perhaps Paranthropus boisei, if you like to give the robust Australopithecines their own genus name. And he was dated to 2.3 million years ago. He was found at Olduvai, of course. This guy was the guy who got them the recognition and the funding for their research. And this guy and the recognition that they got for finding him paved the way to finding this, which was a human foot, a Homo foot, dated to 1.9 million years, found at Olduvai. OH is Olduvai hominid 8, Olduvai hominid 5. And it's nearly complete, well, complete for fossils. And what it showed, which was really striking for 1960, okay, and what it showed was the big toe was actually divergent from the rest of the foot. That is, the big toe, like a chimpanzee's toe or like the thumb on your hand, stuck out a little bit, yet it was on the way to becoming in line with the foot, and the rest of the foot anatomy demonstrates that whoever had this foot was walking on two legs. So that suggests that they were walking on two legs before the big toe had come in line. And so really the exciting thing was that this was a creature that was in transition. The big toe had not come into line and become the big toe yet. It was still a little bit like a thumb on the foot, but we were already walking on two legs. That gave them a big clue that Olduvai Gorge was the place to look if you wanted to understand the evolution of bipedality. Also about that same time, they uncovered a much younger fossil. This one is Olduvai hominid 9, and it's just the top of the head, what you might call a calavera. They've identified this guy as a Homo erectus, which was not a new species at the time. It was already known from Asia, right? The first Homo erectus individuals had been found in Java. You may have heard of Java Man. We'll talk about Homo erectus shortly. But this was a more recent version of human. It had a much larger cranial capacity than Homo habilis. Although I'm not sure that in 1960 we had Homo habilis crania. Probably. No, probably not. But at any rate, it was certainly something much closer to us, and it was younger. So this started to indicate that, well, two interesting things. First interesting thing is this specimen started to indicate that human ancestors had a long history at Olduvai Gorge, right? That Olduvai Gorge was really an important place for human evolution. Our ancestors had been there for a long time. The other interesting thing was, well, this was an Asian species. This was a species that was known from Asia, and now we have Olduvai hominid 9. We know that he's in Africa now. We know this species, Homo erectus, is in Africa. And this suggests perhaps Homo erectus started in Africa. It's hard to say. The dates are tricky with Homo erectus. We'll talk about that shortly. Another one found around the 1960s This was found by Jonathan Leakey, which was another one of the Leakey children before he got out of the family trade. This has been identified as Homo Olduvai hominid 7, I mean, and it's a Homo habilis. The jaw's a little squished up, but it's not as rounded as the other specimen that I showed you. Um, Yet it still has smaller dentition than one would expect for an Australopithecine. I actually don't have a date for this one right here. Uh, it's too bad. But overall, what we can say about Olduvai Gorge is that it covers almost 2 million years of human history. That is, humans and human ancestors had been hanging out in that spot for 2 million years. Now, I'm not saying 2 million years ago. I'm saying around, uh, starting at a period maybe 2.5 million years ago, they were hanging out there, and they exist. And even more strikingly, we know that there were different species of bipedal hominid coexisting there for a period of about 500,000 years, for at least 500,000 years before the robust Australopithecines went extinct. And we also know that more than just having the earliest known human species, we also know that a later species appeared there. So Homo habilis emerged there, and then over the long period of time in which humans were occupying Olduvai Gorge, Homo erectus appeared. So to Lake Turkana, this has been a major research site, one of the places dug up really well by the Leakeys. Turkana Boy is perhaps the most famous specimen uncovered at West Lake Turkana. If you ever get the chance to go to De Anza College and just stroll around there, it's a community college up in Cupertino, they have a full-sized replica of Turkana Boy hanging out in the hallway of the Media Learning Center. So you could just go in and check that out if you ever happen to be in the neighborhood. He's pretty cool. So he was found by Kamoya Kameu and Richard Leakey. This is the most complete Homo erectus ever known. Judging from his molars, he was immature. He was not totally grown up. And just in case we're still wondering, this guy dated to 1.5 million years ago, was definitely bipedal. There's no other interpretation possible of this body. He has distinctly human ilia, distinctly human angle of his femur, and distinctly human tibia. Now, note here, I call him a Homo erectus or Homo ergaster. Oh, whoops. Well, to continue talking about erectus versus ergaster, erectus was the original name for the species, as it was discovered in Java, which we'll talk about later. And when the Leakeys started uncovering specimens that looked like Homo erectus in Africa, they classified them as Homo erectus. But as time went on, as research went on, really, and as more specimens of erectus-like creatures were uncovered in Africa, some people began to suggest that the African examples of Homo erectus were different enough that they should be given their own species name. And so a lot of folks will call Turkana Boy a Homo ergaster. So just remember, I'm going to use both of these terms on these fossil flashcards, or these trading cards, these safari cards, if you like. But just keep in mind that ergaster refers to populations in Africa, and erectus often refers to populations in Asia, but can also be used to refer to both populations. It gets confusing, and I'm not going to make it any easier. This guy was also found at West Lake Turkana, and I like this guy a lot. He's a robust, but he's so robust, he's got such a big sagittal crest and such large zygomatic arches that people have suggested that he is a super robust. He's an Australopithecus ethiopicus, or if you like, a Paranthropus ethiopicus. He was living about 2.5 million years ago. This would have been a sort of more divergent, robust Australopithecine. That is, this would have been sort of the intensification of the traits that the robust Australopithecines had developed distinct from the gracile Australopithecines. So he would have been really specialized for chewing plants all day long with those huge jaw muscles. We call this guy the black skull, and there's a good reason for that. He's really a dark-colored skull, but it also sounds like a really dramatic name, the Black Skull. So let's talk about Homo erectus finally. We've been talking about these Homo erectus specimens dug up in the 60s by the Leakeys, but really, Homo erectus was first known in Asia, and it was discovered by this fella, Eugene Dubois. He named it Pithecanthropus. He didn't realize that it was a human species. He thought it was a human ancestor, right? This was part of that kind of old-fashioned research project where we were looking for the ancestors of humans in Asia, and he thought maybe Pithecanthropus would have been the genus that came before Homo. So his first finds, we call them Java Man. They were discovered in 1891, right? Paleoanthropology actually goes back quite a ways. And they've been dated, but the dating is weird. It's a little sketchy. It's been questioned by many authorities, but they've been dated to 1.8 million years ago. So this would still be the oldest Homo erectus fossils we have, which is interesting because we think, since the Leakey's research seems to indicate this, we think that Homo erectus, or the variety of populations that we are calling Homo erectus, got their start in the Great Rift Valley from Homo habilis. The evidence is very good for that. However, the oldest Homo erectus fossils we have are 1.8 million years in Java. So the date could be wrong. These could be a good deal younger. But also, it could mean that humans were diversifying and spreading out of Africa a little bit sooner than everybody thought. Um, Another famous example of Homo erectus is Peking man. You may have heard of Peking man. Peking, right? It was actually he was found, many specimens, upwards of 40 individuals were found in this cave area called Zhukudian in China. It's near Beijing. And they were dated to 700,000 years ago. They were uncovered in the 20s and the 30s, excavated by a team of European and Chinese scientists. And the real bummer of this story is that it was such a rich find. So many individuals had the potential to say so much about human evolution, but right before World War II, uh, they were being evacuated from China in a boat. They were going to be brought to the U.S., but the boat was sunk by I guess the invading Japanese army, and all of the original fossils found at Zhukudian were lost. We still have replicas, luckily. Many good replicas were made, but all the original fossils, they're somewhere in the bottom of the China Sea. Here's another great Homo erectus specimen, Solo, also known as Solo Man sometimes, uh, which is a little funny for me. Anyway, I don't really have a date for when it was uncovered here, but it was found in Java at Nyangdong, and it's been dated to 50,000 years ago. So because of how recent this one is, 50,000 years ago, and again, the dating could be reinterpreted, some folks have interpreted this as a separate species from other Homo erectus, right? Dubois found his Homo erectus, dated them to 1.8 million years in Java, and then these guys have been dated to 50,000 years in Java, which means that Homo erectus or something like it were hanging out in Java for a very long time. And it has a pretty big cranial capacity, 1,000 cubic centimeters, and really it's mostly craniums that have been uncovered. I understand they've been found in a riverbed. Something about the thickness of these skulls, keeping them preserved underneath the river. Who knows? This guy is very interesting because he kind of screws up the whole story one more time. 2001, David Lordkipanizdi discovered these fossils in Dmanisi. It's the Republic of Georgia. That's not the southern state where Atlanta is. This is the Republic of Georgia. It's an Eastern European country. Um, they've been identified as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, geez, maybe even Homo habilis, because they have very small cranial capacities, only 600 cubic centimeters. That's 150 cubic centimeters more than Lucy and 200 cubic centimeters more than a chimpanzee. They've also been given their own species name by Lord Keepe-Nisdy himself, of course, which would be Homo georgicus, named after Georgia. Now, the funny thing is they were dated to 1.7 million years. So they're in the time range for being either maybe Erectus, who have left Africa, maybe on their way to Asia, or for possibly a very early expansion of Homo habilis. So the idea is maybe 2 million years ago, some of the habilis left the Great Rift Valley, traveled north, got all the way up to the Republic of Georgia in Eastern Europe, hung out there, diversified, and became their own thing. Homo georgicus, perhaps. Uh, then again, they might be an intermediate form between habilis and erectus. Maybe what happened is these guys, Homo georgicus, were primitive, relatively speaking, Homo habilis, left Africa, went to Georgia, evolved some there, and then their ancestors left Georgia and went to Asia and became Homo erectus. That would be a different story. Uh, and it certainly would make sense for the people who believe that the African erectus ought to have their own species named Homo ergaster, because then the ancestors of Homo ergaster would have been the habilis who stayed behind in Africa. Anyway, this is a recent find, and it's pretty mysterious. It confuses a lot of people. It's certainly confusing you guys right now. It confuses me. The only guy who seems to know what's going on is Lord Geepe-Nisdy, but who knows? It's very interesting stuff. Oh, and he's found even more fossils recently. It's exciting. So let's review Homo erectus some more. No, actually, we're not quite ready to review Homo erectus. We're going to talk a little bit about Homo. Well, yeah, we're going to talk about the finds here. Um, so our oldest ones, Homo erectus, oldest versions of Homo erectus slash ergaster would be Java man at 1.8 million years. Then our second oldest ones would be Homo georgicus over here in Georgia, Dmanisi, at 1.7 million years. But where we think they actually evolved in Africa, or where one consensus holds they evolved, we don't start really finding Erectus until 1.2 million years. And we know Peking Man was hanging out around 700,000 years ago in China. And then we have really recent specimens, 50 to 30,000 years old in Java, like Solo Man here. So this is a difficult story to follow. Now, we can't just start with the earliest ones and say, okay, well, then they must have gone to Africa, because maybe we just haven't found the really old ones in Africa. But, so you can tell that trying to trace the evolution of Homo erectus from Homo habilis is kind of a messy proposition. I'll just leave it at that. I'll let you draw your own conclusions here. But this is a good slide to have if you want to try to understand the problems facing people who are trying to figure out Homo erectus. So our summary is Homo erectus, many synonyms, could be known as ergaster, soloensis, georgicus, etc. We know they were alive at least between 1.8 million years ago and 50 to 30,000 years ago. And what that means is they were the most successful human lineage to date. Right? A single species, maybe, that's stretched from 1.8 million years to 50,000 years ago. So really, it's about 1.8 or 1.75, geez, not even 75. Let's just say 1.8 million years this species lasted. That is evolutionary success. Evolutionary success is not building a skyscraper in Dubai or New York City. It's lasting for 1.8 million years. And so, okay, let's see here. What characterizes these guys? They had less prognathism of the face and the jaw than Homo habilis, so their faces were getting flatter, right? Their jaw was coming into line with their occipital plane, not occipital plane, the orbital plane rather, where the eyes are. They had really prominent brow ridges. I go over this in more detail in the bone demo. You'll see they had really prominent brow ridges that stick out. They usually had a sagittal keel, which I may or may not have mentioned in the bone demo, which was just like a little bump that ran front to back on the top of their head. And they would have an occipital bun, which definitely I show you in the bone demo, and that's just sort of a nuchal protuberance on the back of the skull. A wide range of cranial capacities can be found in the specimens that we could call erectus, from 600 cubic centimeters to 1,000 cubic centimeters. And I guess this really is evidence that maybe these were distinct populations, but who knows? It's not the size of the brain, it's what you're doing with it, so it's hard to interpret much about these folks' behaviors from their brain size. Well, at any rate, Homo heidelbergensis. This is our next one. So we've been going Homo habilis, Homo erectus / ergaster, and Homo heidelbergensis is our next one. So Homo heidelbergensis is important for you to know because it's the ancestor of our species. It's also the ancestor of Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, who are a sister species to Homo sapiens. Or at least that's the way I'm going to teach it. There are a number of theories about how we are related to Neanderthals, but you know, I'm already confusing you a lot with this erectus ergaster thing, so we're just going to say Neanderthals are a separate species, Sapiens is a separate species. We'll talk about that a little later. But heidelbergensis is the ancestor of both of these populations, both of these species. So we know heidelbergensis from Africa and Europe, and the oldest specimens are about 600,000 years old. KYA, of course, meaning thousands years old, kilo years old ago. And they had relatively large cranial capacities that got up into modern or contemporary cranial capacities. If your average human nowadays is about 1,400 cubic centimeters, heidelbergensis, yeah, they could do that. They were never found in Asia, or at least not yet. They might have. So the type specimen for Homo heidelbergensis was found in Germany in 1907, and it was dated to 600 or 500,000 years ago. It was not identified as a separate species initially. Initially, it was classified as maybe a Neanderthal. Later on, they took it out and they noticed that it was similar to African fossils that had been found in the meantime. And it was identified with these African fossils. And so it was identified as not a Neanderthal, not a sapiens, but a different species altogether. And so this would be a very old specimen for Europe, 600 to 5,000 years ago, found in Germany. Very old European human. But heidelbergensis started off in Africa. And so this guy here, this is the cobway skull. I love this one. This is definitely in the bone demo, right? Lots of people say he looks like an alien because he seems to have large eye sockets, and his brows certainly accentuate his eyes. This is a heidelbergensis trait, this double ridge, this McDonald's eyebrows. He also kind of looks friendly, huh? Anyway, so he's been dated to 300,000 years ago, and this would have been a big guy. You can tell from the skull, this is a very robust individual. This guy was originally thought to be an African Neanderthal, which was confusing at the time it was found, which was the 20s, because Neanderthals were not known from Africa. And he had a big cranial capacity, which also tended to suggest that he was a Neanderthal who had spread from Europe to Africa. But he's been reinterpreted now as African Homo heidelbergensis. This would put him and his people somewhere near our ancestors, somewhere near the ancestors of Homo sapiens. Here's another African heidelbergensis. This is Bodo, found in Ethiopia. This one's very old, dated to 600,000 years ago. And what makes him interesting is that he could be a transition from ergaster, or erectus in Africa. Excuse me. Oh, geez, how embarrassing. He could be a transition from the erectus / ergaster population in Africa onto heidelbergensis. He was originally thought to be an erectus, But his cranial capacity was just way too big for an erectus. It was way outside of known ranges of erectus crania in Africa at about 1250 cubic centimeters. He wouldn't be too big for an Asian erectus, but he was in Africa, so threw people for a loop. Later on, he was identified. Look at those double arches, identified as maybe a transitional character between Erectus or Ergaster and Heidelbergensis. So this guy would have been maybe, it would have gone perhaps Ergaster, then this guy, then folks like this, and then Homo sapiens. Although these guys may or may not be directly in our line, they might have been a divergent population. Heidelbergensis is also known from Europe, and so actually these are, let's see here. Okay, so sites like Bodo confirmed that Homo erectus, even as it was spreading in Asia, was giving rise to something else in Africa, okay? And so 600,000 years ago, we're getting Heidelbergensis from these late African Homo erectus, or late African Homo ergaster, if you like. And by 500,000 years, we're finding Homo heidelbergensis all over Europe. We're finding them up here in Germany at Mauer, right? That's the jaw I showed you. Or Steinheim is one of the crania that I used in the bone demo. Sometimes identified as a Neanderthal, sometimes identified as its own species, Homo steinheimensis. And also even in England. So we know these guys were going across the English Channel 500,000 years ago over at Boxgrove. In fact, Boxgrove Man I have for you right here. After Piltdown fell through, all the English felt pretty bad about that. And Boxgrove kind of made up for that. It's a very old human specimen from England 500,000 years ago, now dubbed the first Englishman. There was a little bit of hype when in 1996, the analysis of the Boxgrove Man, his limbs seemed like they had been cut. It looks like they had borne cut marks, which suggested that people were cutting the flesh off of his body, presumably to eat it. But no. This was perhaps a funerary rite, or the marks may have been misinterpreted. No good evidence that the first Englishman was a cannibal, though it would be funny. So the Heidelbergensis who got to Europe about 500,000 years ago, they hung out there and they did pretty well, and they underwent a process of adaptation to the European climate. Now think about how the European climate is different from the African climate, right? So we have one group of Heidelbergensis hanging out here, adapting to the savanna mosaic, or continuing to adapt to their savanna mosaic homeland. And then we have one group of Heidelbergensis hanging out here, adapting to the European climate, which is what? Quite cold, definitely more forested than the African climate, or the East African region. And so they started to undergo genetic drift and natural selection. And so by 300,000 years ago, we're uncovering specimens at places like Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca, Spain, specimens which may be considered Heidelbergensis, but could also be considered early Neanderthals. Specimens like Migolon here, who is one of my favorites, because he comes with a story. I'll tell you the story when we talk about stone tools. But he was either a late, robust version of Homo heidelbergensis or an early Neanderthalensis. He might also be a member of his own species, Homo antecessor, but Homo antecessor in that case would be sort of a transitional species between Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis. He would have been living in Spain 350,000 years ago or less. He's an interesting guy. He would have been a big guy himself. I know I talk about Migolon in the bone demo. I'll talk about him some more when we talk about stone tools. So now we have Neanderthals. So the first Neanderthals actually appear about 350 to 250,000 years ago, and they appear in places like the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. They seem to be a radiation of H. heidelbergensis for cold climates. As I've already mentioned. We'll go over those traits that make Neanderthals adapted for cold weather more shortly. But here's just a sort of typical Neanderthal specimen. This is a famous one. This is La Ferracie, found in France, dated to about 70,000 years ago. And La Ferracie demonstrates all the classic Neanderthal features. These are a robust skeleton with thick limbs and heavy bones. And in fact, I'll have a chart later on that'll show you the differences skeletally. Uh, Also, broader rib cage than Homo heidelbergensis, certainly broader rib cage than Homo sapiens. And we can understand these traits as adaptations for cold weather because we see similar adaptations in Homo sapiens who have adapted for cold weather, like the Inuit, Native Americans who live above the Arctic Circle. They tend to be robust with thick limbs, heavier bones, and broader rib cages. Broader rib cages, it keeps all the body heat there in the center of the body. Thick limbs, again, is kind of uh, ensuring that there's less surface area to mass. That means you would lose less body heat through your skin. Neanderthals also had really big brains. They always say that their skulls are football shaped. I don't know. I'll show you in the bone demo. But their brains got between 1,300 cubic centimeters and 1,600 cubic centimeters. That is bigger than Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens brains on average about 1,400 cubic centimeters. Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. Does that mean they were smarter than us? Well, not necessarily, but what is smart? Who knows what they were doing with their brains? And the last trait, and I show this to you in more depth in the bone demo, is there's a retromolar gap. There's a gap between the jaw and the last molar. You'll see the bone demo. I'll show it to you. It doesn't do anything. That retromolar gap doesn't necessarily do anything adaptive, but it's a trait that has appeared probably because of genetic drift that we can use to identify Neanderthals. Anyway, so this guy is known as the Old Man. He is a Neanderthal. He was found at La Chapelle au Centre in France. He's La Chapelle #1, dated to 60,000 years old. The really interesting thing about him is he was very old. He had lost a lot of his teeth, or all of his teeth. He had some of them still hanging out there. You could see where he had lost his teeth. The sockets had healed, which means that he lived long enough to heal his sockets. He didn't starve to death. He was surviving, and the only way he could have survived would have been if he had had help. Somebody must have been chewing his food for him. And that's just great because we know the Neanderthals cared for one another like we care for one another. And we know they valued their old folks like we value our old folks. I mean, that's part of what has made us successful as a species. You live past 35 and you learn a lot of stuff, and you go on living for another 35, 40, or shoot, 50, maybe even more years. And all that while, you're passing on traditions and knowledge to the people who haven't been around as long. That's a late human trait, we think. Here's just, well, this is not just another Neanderthal, but, it's just the top of the head. This is Fieldhofer. This was actually the first Neanderthal that was identified. He was found in a cave in Germany, in the Neander Valley. That's where the Neanderthal or Neanderthal, either way is correct. I believe the German pronunciation would be Neanderthal. This is where we get our names for these guys. They were found in the Neander Valley. Fieldhofer is also interesting because we extracted DNA from this guy. Well, not me. I wasn't there. I wasn't part of the team or anything. But folks, researchers have extracted DNA from this guy. And, well, that's exciting because now we've sequenced the Neanderthal genome. So let's say something more about them, right? We're pretty sure that the Neanderthals had fairly complex social organization. We know that they were using tools. We'll get to tool use later. But in terms of the complexity of their social organization and their culture, we can actually see something like fossil evidence for this. Well, maybe. This is the flower burial, known as the flower burial. It was uncovered in 1960 in Iraq at Shanidar Cave. Uh, it is a burial of a Neanderthal. 60,000 years ago, Neanderthals in Iraq buried this guy. So that part is pretty interesting right there. We know that they were burying their dead, digging holes and putting their dead in the ground. But there were also pollen grains found all over this guy, which suggests that he was buried with flowers. Well, for a long time, that's what it suggested. And it's a very nice story because we have this image of these Neanderthals hanging around their gravesite and preparing a grave with flowers and then putting their friend in the ground and casting flowers over him. An alternative explanation of the flower grains, the pollens found in the grave, has been forwarded. They think that perhaps over the course of 60,000 years in the ground, some little jerboas, which are maybe not jerboas, it was wild gerbils. It was wild gerbils had perhaps buried into the ground and stored some food underground in the grave. And these gerbils, they like to collect flowers and store them underground. So that's another possible origin of the flowers. But at any rate, we know that Shanidar was buried. And that in itself is very interesting. Here's another guy from Iraq, another Neanderthal from Shanidar, who is terribly interesting as well. This is Nandi. He was an older guy, and he had a lot of injuries. Let's see, the left side of his face was crushed. You can see this crushing here, and it deformed his eye socket, so he probably would have been blind, in that eye at least. And something must have got him good because he lost his right hand. So it's hard to say what happened to him. Maybe he got in a bad fight with a person. Somebody got him with some weapons. But also Neanderthals tended to be big game hunters, and they tended to hunt at close range. And so basically Neanderthals got a lot of their food by running up and starting fights with really large animals. And so that might have been what happened to him as well. At any rate, he lived a long time. His eye socket healed, and his bones on his right hand healed. He lost his right hand. 60,000 years ago, this guy lost his right hand, and he was taken good enough care of that he survived. So, and again, this is just indicating that Neanderthals cared for one another. Another very interesting Neanderthal specimen from the Middle East. The Neanderthals, by the way, just in case you haven't noticed, they evolved in Europe, but they traveled out of Europe and into the Middle East. They were heading south and east. So maybe they could have ended up in Africa. Maybe they could have ended up in Asia. Well, they did end up in northern Asia, or creatures like them. And Africa, well, they probably never got to Africa. We'll talk about that later. But Moshe here, he was uncovered in Israel in Kabara Cave. Again, about 60,000 years old. He is the most complete Neanderthal skeleton we have. And you can see how complete he is right there. That's very nice. Also, really striking is he has a hyoid bone. You can't see it very well here, but it is a bone that is in your neck, and it's not attached to your vertebral column. It's just a bone that sort of hovers inside your neck. It is the muscular attachment for your throat muscles. So your Adam's apple, if you can find that, and I'm searching for mine right now, a good way to find it is maybe speak in a very deep voice, and then you can just find it as it moves up and down. And of course, it's more pronounced in men, but women can also find this easily. He has a hyoid bone. He has one of those. He has an Adam's apple. And since we know that that's used for the muscular attachments that we use to talk, it's possible he could have talked. It's possible that he had the muscular attachments necessary for speech. Now, even if he had those muscular attachments, it doesn't mean that he was talking, but it's a pretty good sign. This is not a Neanderthal, and I put this here because I want to make a point. As the Neanderthals were moving south into the Middle East, they were encountering humans, Homo sapiens, who had already been there for a while. So this is School 5. I know I show him to you in the bone demo. He was found in Israel, and he's been dated to about 120,000 years ago, maybe a lot less, but certainly thousands of years before the Neanderthals got to Israel. So the Neanderthals would have been they would have run into a bunch of Homo sapiens as they moved south through the Middle East. Uh, so what did that mean for them? Well, who knows? Let's talk a little bit about Homo sapiens before we start wondering what happened to the Neanderthals. So the typical Homo sapiens traits are we are more gracile, and you can just compare the Neanderthal to the Homo sapiens here. All right, so we're more gracile. That means we're thin, we're more lightly built, we have longer limbs, proportionally speaking, thinner limbs, proportionally speaking. Our teeth are smaller, our heads are smaller. We're just a more lightweight model. We have a high forehead. You can note that here. It's extending straight up over the orbital plane where the eyes line up, whereas Neanderthals had lower, larger crania. So they got a lot of brain in there, but they didn't build it upwards. They built a little bit back. Whoops. Edit that out. Homo sapiens also had a generally smaller jaw, and they had a smaller dental arcade compared to either Heidelbergensis or Neanderthalensis. This is part of their gracile anatomy. But the one thing, and you'll know this if you watch the bone demo, the one thing that distinguishes Homo sapiens from all other species of human is the chin. Homo sapiens has chins. So where did we come from? Wow, all this information, but just these pink boxes. Let me put something up for you. All right. So Homo sapiens, where did we come from? We came from Africa. There's fossil evidence, as uncovered by the Leakeys, that suggests the oldest Homo, that is Homo habilis, came from Africa. We know that Homo habilis gave rise to African ergaster, or African erectus. We know they gave rise to Heidelbergensis in Africa. While some of the Heidelbergensis went to Europe, some of them stayed in Africa. And we know those guys were doing something. But even with all that information, there has been an ongoing debate about the geographical origins of our species. Well, this lady, Rebecca Kahn, in 1987, she compared the mitochondrial DNA from 147 different people and devised a molecular clock. Using her molecular clock, she estimated that Africa, about 200,000 years ago, was where the first Homo sapiens appeared. This makes sense. African Homo sapiens, everybody who's descended from Africa, we all are descended from Africa, but if you look at contemporary Homo sapiens in Africa, Africans, you see that they have the most diverse genes out of any human group. So, and I've said this before, any two individuals from Africa are likely to be as distantly related to one another, genetically speaking, as any two individuals from anywhere else in the entire world. And this makes sense with Rebecca Kahn's findings because that would indicate that African populations of Homo are the oldest. They have had the longest amount of time to diversify into a number of different genotypes and phenotypes. Whereas populations elsewhere are likely to be less diverse because they just haven't been there as long. But 200,000 years for human origin, that seems pretty good, right? We know that we had some transitional crania there, 350,000 years ago, 600,000 years ago, in between that period. So the emergence of populations that were genetically similar to contemporary populations, pegging that at 200,000 years, that's a really nice piece of evidence that seems to fit very well with the fossil evidence that we have found in Africa. So 200,000 years ago for the human origins, right? The Neanderthals, by contrast, maybe 250 or 300,000 years ago in Europe. Here are some early Homo sapiens that we have. This is Homo 1 from Ethiopia. As you can see, really broken up, 195,000 years old. It's got a chin. Yeah, that's a human. Herto Man here. I kind of like him. Uh, I like the skull for some reason. I just find this an interesting specimen. Aesthetically, I mean. Um, and I like the reconstruction here. I look at the reconstruction and I don't know. He looks like a guy. He looks like somebody you might meet on the street. He was discovered by Tim White. Possible subspecies of sapiens. Calls it Homo sapiens idaltu. 160,000 years old. Tim White's idea is that this was a separate population of Homo sapiens that drifted apart from the line that led to us. He thinks that Homo sapiens idaltu was a population of Homo sapiens that retained some pretty archaic Homo heidelbergensis-like characteristics as at the same time as other populations were evolving more into a gracile Homo sapiens form. I don't know, right? There's going to be a lot of diversity in any population. He looks pretty much like us. I'm sure his genetic material was not too far from us. I don't know. These are some interesting finds. We get these from caves around the river mouth of the River Classes in South Africa, dated between 120,000 and 90,000 years. They got cranial pieces, and you could tell a lot from some pieces of the cranium, right? It's not that bad if you just have a nice big chunk of the back of the skull, because you can measure the angles and the curvature of it, and you can kind of extrapolate what the rest of the skull would have looked like using information from other skulls. And so, about 120,000 years ago, we've got quote unquote modern anatomy, contemporary looking Homo sapiens hanging out in South Africa. Even more interesting to me is that they had a middens in their cave. What a middens is, if you've taken Anthropology 3, which is Intro to Archaeology, you know a middens is a trash heap, which means about 75,000 years ago, these guys were keeping all their trash in one spot. That's housekeeping. That's sanitation. That is a human thing. Maybe the Neanderthals did this too. I think they did. But this is something that's, starting to echo contemporary human behavior. Oh, and again, since we're talking about Homo sapiens, might as well show you School 5 again. So we know that these guys were migrating out of Africa by 60,000 years ago, although this guy could have been 120,000 years old, suggesting that by 120,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, even the kind of archaic populations that would have been around then, were spreading out of the Rift Valley into South Africa and into places like Israel. Maybe even more stunning in terms of the breadth and span of human travels is Mungo Man, who is probably the oldest human fossil found in Australia, found at Lake Mungo. There's also a great movie called Lake Mungo, or maybe it's just Mungo, but it's a horror movie. It's great. It has nothing to do with anthropology. Never mind. But I watched it because I thought maybe there's something about Mungo Man in there, but there wasn't. I'm sorry, I'm a dork like that. Anyway, so he's been dated between 60 and 40,000 years. This is pushing it. 40,000 years would still make him the oldest human fossil from Australia. So we can say that humans got to Australia by 40,000 years ago. And he was buried as well, so that's interesting stuff. And then for North America, Homo sapiens was in North America. The dates are getting pushed back. 14 and 13,000 years is not that bad now. Used to be, in old textbooks, you'd find 10,000 years. But some of the oldest evidence of humans in the New World, so to speak, have been coprolites found in Paisley Caves of Oregon and Monteverde in Chile. And coprolites, that's feces. So fossilized human dung 14,000 years ago, found in Oregon and Chile, suggests that humans were in North America as early or as late as 14,000 years. So, humans moving around, going all over the place. Humans really going places? What about the Neanderthals? We get them starting about 250,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago, around here. And we know that they went north and they went east. So we know the Neanderthals filled out Europe and that they came all the way up here into Central Asia. We get them at Teshiktosh. And then even farther out here, my arrow has now gone off the screen to indicate places like Siberia, there are Neanderthal-like people there. We also know that the Neanderthals had made it to Iraq, which is here, Shanidar, and made it to Israel, Kabara, Kafsa, by about 60,000 years. Well, Kafsa is probably Jordan, but anyway. Um, so we know that it was about here where they were encountering humans. Humans who were leaving Africa and going this way. Oh, maybe humans came up around here too. And so this slide was building up to this. Neanderthals lasted in Europe until about 30,000 years ago. So what happened to them? Okay, that's a good question. You might see where I'm going with this. So what happened to the Neanderthals? Well, who can say for sure? But there are at least three, well, credible possibilities. Number one, they might have been outcompeted by Homo sapiens. But there's really no evidence for this. There are, well, I don't know. There are people who claim to have found Neanderthal Homo sapiens hybrids, but like you could tell that from a skeleton. It's just very doubtful that you could tell that sort of thing. But really, the thing is that there's no evidence that they were in the same place at the same time in such a consistent manner that Homo sapiens would have been the driving force of their extinction if they went extinct. Another possibility is that they interbred with Homo sapiens, and that certainly happened in some places. But over the entire geographic range, it's doubtful that that would have happened. Now, they definitely did interbreed with humans. People like Gerald Lowenstein here, who's actually the husband of Adrian Zillman, who wrote your coloring book, have managed to discover techniques to extract DNA from fossil materials. So this was science fiction, even in the 90s. You know Jurassic Park, right? Extracting dinosaur DNA. Well, can't extract dinosaur DNA yet, but Gerald Lowenstein and his colleagues have figured out how to extract DNA from Neanderthals. And having analyzed that DNA, that work being done by folks like Svante Pabo here, who does a lot of paleoanthropology work in a laboratory using genetic techniques, these folks have determined that indeed some Homo sapiens of today, some contemporary people, contain genes that originated with Neanderthals. In fact, some sizable portion of the genome, and I've told you about my relationship with numbers. If you're interested in this, I can find out more for you. But some sizable portion, or significant, noticeable rather, portion of the genomes of people of Northern European ancestry can be traced to Neanderthals. So hey, I've probably got some Neanderthal in me. Some of you probably do as well. But did that drive the Neanderthals to extinction, interbreeding? Did they just get wrapped up? Was there wrapped up in the human? Was there too much gene flow for them to maintain an identity as a distinct species? I don't know. There was a third thing going on. The Neanderthal phenotype probably could not deal with a changing environment. So this period of time, we're talking 70, 60, 50,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. This was a period of climatic change in Europe where the Neanderthals originated. Neanderthals had very high demand metabolisms. They used up a lot of energy hunting and keeping warm in the cold climates for which they were adapted. And in order to do that, in order to maintain their energy, well, think about cold climates. There's not a lot of plant matter that's going to be very nutritious for you in those climates. So actually, Neanderthals had to eat a lot of meat, and they relied upon big game. The sorts of injuries that we find on Neanderthal skeletons are consistent with what you would expect to find inflicted upon people who had gotten into fights with rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths and and aurochses and things like that, large mammals that would have been living in Europe during the Ice Age, so to speak, during this period of cold weather. But once the Ice Age started to end, once these glaciers started to retreat from northern Europe, started to retreat from Europe as a whole, and the climate became more temperate, the big game went away as well. As the big game was outcompeted by organisms that were better suited to these temperate climates. So there's the possibility then that the Neanderthals died for want of meat, that the big game animals upon whom they relied died out, and then the Neanderthals would have went with them. Now, not all the Neanderthals, but just the typically Neanderthal phenotype. Others might have gotten mixed up with the Homo sapiens, and then the Neanderthal robust phenotype might have been lost. It's hard to know for sure. So, let's try to cap things off, and then I'm going to introduce one more character, and that's going to be the end of this lecture. So 5 to 7 million years ago, right? This is our summary here. 5 to 7, 7 to 5 million years ago, really, we had hominoid apes, right? We didn't have really quite anything quite like a human. We have Sahelanthropus from Chad here. We've got Ardipithecus over here in Ethiopia, and we've got Auroran over here in Kenya. All right, we have a diversity of hominoid apes, an adaptive radiation of hominoid apes who are trying to make the best of this new savanna mosaic habitat. 5 million years ago, we have Ardipithecus is diverging from its arboreal ancestors, right? And 3.7 million years ago, here in Laetoli, and then up here in Ethiopia, we have Lucy, we have Australopithecines, who are now habitually bipedal. By 2.8 million years, we know that the Australopithecine genus, Australopithecus, has gone all over East Africa. So we're finding them in South Africa, and we're finding them all through this area here. So we know that they were traveling. That means they were successful and they were spreading out. We also know that by 2.8, they had diversified into two groups, the robusts and the graciles, who would never meet again. Well, they might meet, face to face, but as species, as genetic populations, they would not get sewn back together. There would not be gene flow at this point. They would be distinct species at least. So at 2.3 million years, we start to get evidence that Homo habilis, that's these red stars, have diverged from the gracile Australopithecines. And we're looking here in Olduvai. 2.3 million years, the robusts are still numerous, and they have actually outlived their gracile ancestors. The gracile Australopithecines are now no more by 2.3 million. And the robusts continue to live alongside humans in places like Olduvai Gorge. At 1.9 million, we see Homo habilis on the decline, but we also see them in places like South Africa. So we know they were successful and spread out. By 1.5 million, just calling up the image. By 1.5 million, we see that Homo erectus has now replaced Homo habilis in East Africa. So Homo habilis is no more. It's been replaced by this new population, Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, if you like. And by 1.8 million, however, right, we have these funny things going on. We know that we have 1.7 million, we know we have erectus in Eastern Europe, and 1.8 million, we have erectus in Java. So there's some funny business here with the dates or the migrations. Something about the story isn't quite right yet. About 700,000 years ago, we see erectus in China. And about 600,000 years ago, we see a new species, Heidelbergensis, in Europe and also in Africa. Right, where's the African ones? Here we are. So we got Kabwe here for 300,000. Bodo for perhaps 500,000, whatever it said before. And we've got some European Heidelbergensis up here, Miguelon, about 350,000 years. Um, so what we have going on between 600 and 300,000 years is we have Heidelbergensis who appeared in Africa diverging into two groups, an African group and a European group. 350 to 250,000 years, the European Heidelbergensis began to look a lot more like Neanderthals. Um, and by 200,000 years, the African Heidelbergensis are starting to look a lot like sapiens. At 120,000 years, we know we have Homo sapiens in South Africa, but we also have them up here in Israel. Or perhaps 120,000 years. The date for School Cave could be sketchy, but okay, let's say 120,000 years, we're on our way out of Africa. 70,000 years, the Neanderthals, the descendants of the European Heidelbergensis, have attained what we call the classical Neanderthal features, which just means that they are now certainly what we think of as Neanderthals. They are no longer transitional. We've got a new species in Europe. And by 60,000 years, these classic Neanderthals are getting, well, they're either succeeding in having to spread out, or maybe they're just leaving their homes as the climate changes. Why would they be going south? Well, we know they're going south by 60,000 years. And that's about where they stopped. They got no further than Iraq and Israel. Maybe up here they enjoyed some more success. Okay, so 40,000 years we have Neanderthals hanging on in France and Spain. By 30,000 years, we still have Homo erectus hanging on here in Java. 40,000 years, we've got Homo sapiens all the way over here in Australia. 30,000 years ago, this is a new one, the X-woman. She dies in a cave in Siberia. The X-woman. All we have are a few finger bones. This is part of a new group that I'm not going to talk about much beyond here, called the Denisovans. They were humans, and we have finger bones from the X-woman, and the DNA has been sequenced by Svante Pabo, and he has determined that they were not Neanderthals and they were not humans, although they interbred with both. Well, not Neanderthals and not Homo sapiens, but they did interbreed with both. They had some genes with both, in common with both. And so perhaps Neanderthals were actually quite successful and made it up here by 30,000 years ago, and humans would have been doing this as well. By humans, I mean Homo sapiens. And then finally, to add on to this last bunch of creatures who were alive 30,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, we have a distinct human species that's been uncovered on a small island here called Flores Island in Indonesia. These are the hobbits. I'll talk about them next, but before I leave this slide, I want to impress upon you 30,000 years ago, humans in Australia and Africa and all of the world. So we had Homo sapiens all over the world. We had Neanderthals hanging on in France and Spain. That's two. We had the Denisovans in Siberia. That's three species. We had Erectus hanging on in Java. That's four species of human living on the planet at the same time 30,000 years ago. And we have Homo floresiensis, aka the hobbits, living on Flores Island, perhaps 30,000 years ago. So all roughly within the same period of time, we have five distinct species of humans living on the planet. There is nothing in contemporary experience like this. And so some folks have compared this to like a Lord of the Rings kind of situation with elves and trolls and orcs and hobbits and dwarves and humans. Well, I'm sure it wasn't quite as fantastical as all that, but it's still something that you just don't have any experience of in the contemporary world. Multiple species of living creature, multiple species of not just living creature, but of intelligent, culture-bearing, technological creature on the same planet at the same time. We just don't know anything about this nowadays, but it was apparently the case just a few thousand years ago. Oh, right, and then Homo sapiens got to America 14,000 years ago. That's a little less exciting for me. But let's talk about Homo floresiensis, because Well, there's something to be learned from these guys. So the type specimen is Flo here. She looks pretty good. She was found in Lingboa Cave on Flores Island, which is part of Indonesia, and she's been dated to between 48 and 18,000 years of age. Well, actually, the skeletal material there has been dated more specifically. I don't remember those dates, but dated more precisely. I don't remember those specific dates, but the material found in Lingboa ranges from 48 to 18,000 years of age. So Flo here is really complete. She was the first one found, and she's got a little teeny brain. She's got a cranial capacity of only about 380 cubic centimeters, which puts her a little bit smaller than a chimp with a big brain. But then again, that doesn't mean that she was stupid. She was a human. She was a Homo floresiensis. She knew how to make stone tools. Um, it's what you do with the brain that matters. And people like Dean Falk are looking at endocasts. In fact, Dean Falk suggests that she is a human and has ruled out that she's an Australopithecine or anything like that. So Flo was about 30 when she died, and she was only about 3 feet tall. So this is why these folks were called the Hobbits, right? She was discovered in what, 2002, 2001, something like that. And no, it must have been 2002. It was after The Lord of the Rings had come out, or at least the first movie in that series had come out, and so people were all Hobbit crazy for a little while, and they called her a Hobbit. 3 feet tall, little tiny humans. Oh, let's just get all that text up. Yeah, when I switched slide programs from PowerPoint to LibreOffice, some of my slides, they weren't really destroyed or broken per se, but it moved a lot of my text around. So that's what you're seeing on these occasions where I have a broken slide or something. The discoverers of flow and Dean Falk also agree that even though she was really small, even though her brain was pretty small, uh, it was shaped like a Homo sapiens brain. So we wonder, where did these people, these Homo floresiensis, come from? These little tiny people. Um, well, I should first say that other folks have suggested that they were just dwarf humans, or just a population of humans who had uh, kind of genetically drifted apart and somehow preserved some sort of gene for dwarfism. But her skeleton doesn't really seem to show the sorts of traits you would find in a little person. And by little person, I mean, people who are what used to be called, I guess, dwarves, or derogatorily midgets, although that's not a good word to use. But Flo does not seem to, she's not a little person. She doesn't have little person proportions. She has sort of the standard proportions one might expect from a Homo sapiens. So she's not one of those. She wasn't sick necessarily. Some people thought that maybe she has some sort of congenital defect. That does not seem to be the case. Her discoverers and Dean Falk agree that she looks rather like a Homo sapiens and is probably a distinct species descended from Homo sapiens. Although at the bottom here, some people have suggested that she's a distinct species descended from Homo erectus, whom we know were in the area, but Homo sapiens were also in the area. So who knows? At any rate, uh, despite how small her brain was, they used tools, and that's what the next lecture is going to be about. We're going to talk about humans as a cultural history through tools. But before we get to that, I want to tell you why. Well, I want to remark first of all on the bones that she was found with, right? So Flo's people were probably eating miniature elephants and giant rats, little 3 foot tall elephants, and then big, like 3 foot long rats. And so what I wanted to get to is these are island adapted humans. Well, so why is getting small adaptive for an elephant or a human on an island, but getting big is adaptive for a giant rat? It has to do with the amount of energy available in the food in the environment. If you're on an island, the resource pool is very limited. So how can you respond to limited resource pools? Well, one way, if you're a big animal, is you can try to respond to a limited resource pool by becoming smaller and needing fewer resources. So that's why Flores Island had miniature elephants as well as miniature people. But the other way you can respond to limited resources is to get really big. And so, if you're a small creature and you need to compete more effectively with other small creatures, getting big actually really helps. So, miniature elephants, giant rats, and little tiny Homo sapiens turned into Homo floresiensis. These are creatures that have been adapted to an island. And what I think this goes to show is that hey, Homo sapiens was not the end of the road. As long as there was the possibility for reproductive isolation and genetic drift, Homo sapiens kept evolving and actually gave rise to a new species. Homo floresiensis evolved from us, and they are also extinct now, or perhaps have been kind of uh, genetically flowed over, reincorporated into Homo sapiens populations. It's hard to say. But anyway, that's the end of this lecture. Next lecture, we're going to pick up the history of human culture from the history of the human species from a cultural perspective. I'm going to go get a drink of water and take a break. I'll see you guys in a few minutes, or in a few hours, or maybe a few days.